Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar of our monthly series, where we aim to highlight rigorous research in the scientific study of international migration. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is David Layton, one of the four co-directors of the IPL, along with Dominique Hangartner, Claire Adida, and Jens Heinmüller. I am one of those four, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. But first, a few housekeeping logistics. The session is being recorded. A recording of the presentation will be available on Immigration Policy Lab website and YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. During the last 15 minutes, I will select a few questions for our presenter, Guy Grossman, to answer. Due to our limited time together, we will not be able to answer all of your questions. But at the end of the seminar, we will send a link to a Google form in the Zoom chat where you can provide feedback and suggest speakers for future seminars. The link can also be found on the Immigration Policy Lab website. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Guy Grossman, who is the David M. Knott Professor of Global Politics and International Relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's done important work on a wide variety of subjects: refugee hosting in Uganda, the ultra-rich use of media ownership, government responsiveness in developing countries. He's also a participant and author in the Breakthrough Metaketa Initiative and was a participant in their first major project on community policing. His recent publications include The Politics of Climate Change, recently published in the Annual Review, Political Science Under Pressure, Competition and Collaboration in a Growing Discipline in Perspective on Politics, Ethical Oversight and Impact Evaluations, External Advisory Committees to Assess Programming Risks, a publication of the PNAS. This title talk today, Aid Cuts for Refugees Reduce Welfare Without Increasing Self-Reliance. Welcome to our Science of International Migration webinar, Guy Grossman, and the floor is yours.
No problem. Thanks, David. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yep, I assume that everything is working. Okay, let me start with thanking the organizers of the seminar for this great idea, also for inviting me. I want to also thank UNHCR and WFP, our partners in this project, that without their support, we would not be able to undertake the study. And I also want to thank over close to 5,500 refugees that we surveyed for this project for the support and patience with that, and for all the work that they've done with us. So without further ado, this is a new project, a new paper. It's joint with Yang Zhu. She's a professor at Dartmouth College, with Shelby Carvalho. She's a postdoc at Stanford, and Imandar, who is a pre-doc in our lab at Penn. And as the title suggests, this is a paper that looks at the effect of aid cuts on refugees. And as the title will suggest, this is not going to be a happy story. Okay, so let me start with motivating our study. I think a good place to start when we are thinking about aid cuts to refugees is making sure we understand the encampment model for refugee hosting in low and low middle income countries, and the challenges that this model is currently facing. As many of you know, there's around 40 million refugees globally, and 25 million of those are hosted in low and lower middle income countries. And most refugees in these settings live years in designated camps or refugee settlements. And as part of the hosting, they rely heavily on food and cash assistance from UNHCR and WFP. Now, it's the idea that refugees in these settings will be in designated camps was always supposed to be a temporary solution. But if we look at the list of the permanent solutions, it's easy to see that they are out of reach for the vast majority of refugees, right? The three permanent solution that for refugees, whether it's voluntary repatriation, resettling in a high-income country, or being naturalized in host countries, they are not available to about 95% of refugees. Only 4 or 5% of the stock of refugees in each year enjoys one of these permanent solutions. So what that means that the temporary solution of living in camps and relying on support from UNHCR and WFP became the dominant model of hosting refugees for the last 4 or 5 decades, right? This de facto, this permanent solution became the temporary solution de facto became a permanent solution. And it was a steady equilibrium for many years, right? High-income countries provided funds as part of a burden sharing agreement, which is kind of fine for them because then they didn't have to host refugees. Low-income countries hosted, but they benefited quite a bit. So a lot of the humanitarian aid to support the hosting of refugees allowed them to, because refugee camps are located usually in the periphery, close to the border, in areas that are very far from urban centers. The humanitarian aid allowed them to bring some development to these areas. Hosting refugees also allowed developing countries to kind of curry favor with the high-income countries, so they benefited from other ways as well. And the IOs also, the UNHCRs of the world and WFP also kind of benefited from like really big resources that allowed them to provide services, food and cash distribution, have managed big budgets and manage big staff. The people that didn't benefit so much from us was the refugees that were just living in camps for many years, highly dependent, without much ability to sustain themselves without support. This model that has been in place for really 4 or 5 decades is now under tremendous stress. And the stress is coming from the fact that humanitarian funding is increasingly falling short. So if you look at this figure, what we see on the y-axis is the funding that UNHCR is asking to support the hosting of refugees. And the dark blue is the part of the funding that they need that is not that has been not met, and the light blue is what is met. And what you can see in this figure is between 2010 and 2019, about 2/3 of the request was funded. But starting in 2019, 2020, we're moving to a world that more than 50% of the needed funds are not provided. These funding requests are unmet, in part because the size of the refugee population is increasing, but also high-income countries have less will to provide resources. So the combination of more refugees and less funding is generating a real crunch in terms of like funding. And so how are the agencies responding to this dramatic shortfall in funding? What they've been doing in recent years is trying to move from a model in which support to refugees is based on status to a model in which support will be based on needs. This is referred to as prioritization. And we see the implementation of prioritization policies in countries like Jordan, Rwanda, Kenya, and the country that we'll be studying here today, Uganda. And the hope and the expectation is that if we reduce the amount of support that refugees will receive, this will kind of incentivize them towards greater self-reliance, right? Like they will maybe increase their labor supplies, maybe they'll start small businesses, maybe they'll farm more intensely, maybe they will move completely out of camp into, major urban cities or peri-urban, like secondary cities, right? Now, okay, so if that's going to happen, like what will be the outcome? So there's things that we know and there's things that we don't know. So we definitely know that when we provide aid for refugees, And we know that from a big cash transfer literature, both in the humanitarian and outside the humanitarian sector, we know that it increases welfare. There's a big literature on that. But what we don't know is what happens when there's retrenchment, when aid gets reduced. How are refugees going to respond to this reduction in aid? Will it unleash a productive response, or it will deepen their vulnerability? And this is exactly the question that we pose in this study. What we are interested is in better understanding what are the consequences for reducing humanitarian aid in a large refugee hosting setting. As I said, in our context, it's going to be in Uganda. Now, when we're thinking theoretically about like how refugees will respond to a dramatic reduction in the support that they receive, we can think about two ideal types of coping mechanisms or strategies. One would be productive coping. That's the hope of self-reliance, right? That's the promise of self-reliance, where you kind of incentivize to increase wage employment, maybe start a business, as I mentioned before, expand farming, migrate to places with better income generating opportunities. Maybe these types of migration of at least some part of the household will also generate remittances that then can be used for productive in productive ways, right? So that's one type of outcomes that we might find. But there might be other coping strategies that refugees will adopt, especially if the productive coping strategies are not available for them. For example, they might decide to, the reduction in aid might force them to increase debt. Debt by itself could be productive if you use it to start a business, but it could be quite destructive if you are only using it to smooth consumption. You might decide to reduce your food intake. You might decide to utilize health services to a lesser degree. Some might resort to crime. You might decide to take your kids out of school and maybe increase child labor, right? And so ex ante, it's not clear whether we will see that the average refugee will be adopting productive coping strategies or destructive coping strategies. And this is exactly what we're going to be set up to study in this paper. And so we're going to study that in the context of Uganda. Uganda is a really good context to study these questions for several reasons. One, it's the largest refugee hosting country in Africa, so it makes it, and the fourth largest in the world, so it makes it an important case. But Uganda is also a good case to study with the question of response to aid reduction, because it's widely regarded as a model of inclusive refugee governance, right? Uganda allows refugees the freedom of movement. Refugees in Uganda have the right to work, to own land, to transfer assets, to access public services. So this is a context in which if self-reliance could potentially substitute for aid reduction, it should be in Uganda, right? So it might not be the case in Kenya or Tanzania, where you don't have freedom of movement for refugees and you don't have a right to work. But in the context where you do have that, at least in the potential for increasing self-reliance exists. A few other things about refugees in Uganda. Over 90% of them live in refugee settlements. Only around 7% live in urban areas. About 6% in Kampala, which is the green star. The majority of refugees in Uganda are from South Sudan, smaller share from the DRC, Somalia, and Burundi. What you see here in blue are settlements outside the study area, and the red settlements are the study area settlements. I think it's a good time to kind of describe a bit what was the level of support that refugees received in Uganda prior to prioritization, and then make sure that we all understand how the prioritization policy took place. So until 2021, the World Food Program had the program of providing all refugee households that live in refugee settlements with food assistance ratio. The idea was to ensure that every household can meet basic survival guidelines of 2,100 calories per person per day. And the support came in two ways. It could be either support in kind, so there was a food basket. You can see here on the slide what the food basket included, or instead the equivalent in cash, which was 31,000 Ugandan shilling per individual per month. So we can think about this level of support as the 100% assistance level before there were reductions that were coming from due to aid shortages. Okay, so this is the level of support until 2021. In November 2021, the study settlements, which is what I showed you before, the ones in red, the ratios were reduced to all households in the settlements to 60%. So if this was 100%, it was reduced to 60%, but across the board. So November 21, no prioritization, it's just a general reduction in aid. We focus on these three settlements, Adjumani, Kiradongo, and Palabek, because the way things were phased in terms of make for a nice research design. In other settlements, the schedule was slightly different. If people are interested, I can give some in the Q&A some more information about how things worked out in other settlements. Now, in mid-2022, UNHCR and WFP conducted a census of all refugee households in Uganda that reside in refugee settlements. And as part of that census, they collected information on vulnerability indicators. There are 13 vulnerability indicators that then UNHCR and WFP used in order to construct a vulnerability score. Then in July 2023, using the vulnerability score that was constructed as part of the census of April, prioritization kicked in. What did prioritization entail? For the 14% of households that were deemed most vulnerable, they were able to keep the same level of pre-existing level of support. So that would be the 60% ratio, meaning the same level that they were receiving since November 2021. For those that were deemed moderately vulnerable, that's 80% of the household, the aid support, the assistance was cut by half to only 30% of the pre-November 21 level. And for those that were least vulnerable, that's about 4% of household, the support was reduced to zero. We are going to focus only on the comparison between the most vulnerable and the moderately vulnerable. And in this study, we won't be collecting data on the least vulnerable. This is something that we can think about, like maybe consider in future works. Okay. Let's move to talk about the research design. How are we taking this process and generating from that a design that will allow us to estimate the causal effect of aid reduction to those that were deemed only moderately vulnerable? So we're going to use a regression discontinuity design that builds on the fact that, one, the vulnerability score was generated through a census that took place a year before the policy was announced. So households were not aware that the data that is being collected is going to be used in any way to engage in a prioritization process. But we also building on the fact that the vulnerability score is deterministic, right? So if you score below 3.49 so taking these 13 variables and creating like this index, if you score below 3.49, you are deemed not sufficiently vulnerable, and you get a 50% cut in the ratios, right? And if you score 3.49 and above, you are able to retain the pre-existing level because you're deemed most vulnerable. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to be because the cutoff is relatively arbitrary, right? That's just the money that they had allowed them to keep it for 14% and reduce it for 86%. The 14% cutoff or the 3.49 is a bit arbitrary. We're going to collect data on households just above and just below the vulnerability cutoff score. And the idea is that households on both sides of the vulnerability scores are very similar to each other. And so we're going to use just a very standard RD framework. And you can see here the framework where the treatment, so to speak, in this regression is determined by your vulnerability score. And what we're trying to estimate is tau, which is the local average. It will be the local average treatment effect. I know that not everyone here on the call is necessarily very familiar with regression discontinuity designs. So we just prepared a slide that can help with the intuition. So what we can see here in this slide, on the x-axis, we have a vulnerability score. And then the line here is exactly the cutoff, 3.49. Right? This is simulated data. Everyone on the left, all the red, will be deemed moderately vulnerable, and so they can they're subjected to 50% 8 cut, and everyone on the above 3.49 is considered vulnerable and is able to keep the pre-existing level, right? And on the y-axis, we have here a simulated outcome, for example, wage income. And what the RD does is basically is estimating. It runs a regression on each side of the cutoff, and is estimating the difference exactly at the cutoff, right? And so all the findings that I'm going to show you are estimations of this difference here, where people on each side of the cutoff are very, 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 very similar, right? And we've done a bunch of tests to demonstrate that these groups are indeed very similar to each other. Okay. The data that we have is from an original survey, two surveys that we fielded, one in March and July, between March and July 2024, with about 5,400 households on each side of the split between the two sides of the vulnerability score cutoff. And then we did another round of surveys in May 2025 with the same household. So this is a panel study. We had very little attrition. You can see the numbers of observations. And so we can think about the first round as short-term effects, and we can think about the second round of data collection, which takes place around 2 years after prioritization, as medium-run effects, right? But because we have a panel, we can also, for each household, look at the difference between the outcome in round 2 and round 1. And this will allow us to see how outcomes evolved over time for both those that were able to retain the level of support and those that the support will cut by 50%. Some basic information about our sample. 92% of household heads are female. Most of them are married. Average age is 36. Mean household size is 9. Households have been in Uganda for about 10 years. And almost all of them have lived in the same settlement throughout their time in Uganda. And 99% of our sample is from South Sudan. In terms of outcomes, on the left, you'll see outcomes that map into productive coping strategies. So this will be employment, migration, remittances, and farming. And on the right side, you'll see outcomes that map into more what we call destructive or negative outcomes. For example, food insecurity, and physical illness, anxiety, and depression. This will all kind of map. We can think of them as well-being. We can look at debt, the number of loans, and whether the loans are for consumption or for starting a new business. We can look at assets, whether people are selling productive assets, and we can look also at safety and security to see whether there's been an increase in crime after prioritization. Okay, so let's see what we found. The first set of findings that I want to share with you is employment. And what we see here are findings after a year, that's round one, results after 2 years, and then the within household change, so that's round two minus round one, so how things evolved between 1 year and 2 years. And the bottom line, I want you to focus here. We're not seeing a change in household head employment. This is household head employment. We see a bit of there's a bit of increase in wage employment in year one, but this kind of disappeared by year two. So whether we're looking at wage employment or self-employment, we're not seeing by year two that prioritization, or in this case, aid cuts, aid reduction, push those that are receiving only 50% support to increase employment. This is true for the household head, and it is also true for other household members. Whether we look at the number of employed household members, whether we look at their total earning, you're looking at year one, looking at year two, we're not seeing that households that were subjected to a 50% aid reduction, we're not seeing that they compensated by increasing employment. Okay. Moving to other productive ways of coping with such a dramatic shock. The top panel will look at migration. We can look at any household member exited, and here is the destination, whether they returned to South Sudan, migrated to other place in Uganda, or migrated to a third country. Again, we see that households that were subjected to an aid reduction, we do not see that they responded by increasing the migration of household members to any of the destination. So we are not seeing that this is the way in which household responded to the shock. Not surprising, because most of the remittances that refugees receive come from household members that left to places where there's more greater income generating opportunities. We're also not seeing that the loss of support was compensated by remittances. And finally, when we look at the last panel here at the bottom, when we look at access to farming, both in terms of access to land and the total land size that is devoted for farming, again, we're not seeing that households that lost 50% of the support have responded by increasing farming activities. So just kind of let's take stock. In each of these margins, whether we're looking at employment, whether we're looking at migration, whether we're looking at remittances, whether we're looking at farming, we're not seeing that households that were subjected to a 50% reduction in aid support were able to increase on these margins to compensate for the loss of income. So how did they absorb the shock? If you look at the top panel, we're moving to report some results on debt, and what we're going to show is that one way for absorbing the shock is by increasing indebtedness. If we look here at round two, this is new debt. We see that households that were subjected to aid reduction are more likely to take debt, new loans, and importantly, almost the entirety of these new loans were consumption loans. Okay, only about 2% of the entire sample report that they took a loan for investing in a kind of like self-employment. Almost all of the debt is has been used to smooth consumption. Okay. And given the fact that the productive ways of coping with the shock were not available, we see that the reduction of aid has been reflected also in the deterioration of well-being. I'm going to ask you to focus here on the right on what happened between year two and year one. We see that households subjected to aid reduction reporting more illnesses and injuries, and they are also reporting lower levels of when they say report about health. This falls slightly below significance level, but we see the sign is very, very clear. So kind of just summarizing what we're seeing that the shock gets absorbed through debt and to some extent through declining in well-being, especially in terms of like household health. Okay, so far we showed that there's just no difference between those that retain the level of support and those that aid was reduced to them. Okay, but that could be also, but that doesn't necessarily mean that for both groups everything stayed the same. Okay, so what we also do is look for the entire sample, whether between year two and year one things stayed the same or things have deteriorated. And we find that across the board, both for the group that retained aid at the same level and the group that it was reduced, things deteriorate across many domains. We see that employment gets dropped sharply for household heads, monthly hours dropped, earnings declined. We see the debt size increased to now something like $100 debt for the average household. And given the fact that employment generates around $1 a day, this is about like indebtedness of 3-4 months of work. We see crime victimization rose, crime incidents rose, and we see a real dramatic decrease for both groups in anxiety and depression, something at the magnitude of 0.6 standard deviation. Life satisfaction declines by something like 0.5 standard deviation. And we also see that the illnesses and injuries that we reported before has declined for both groups between year two and year one quite dramatically. Okay. With this in mind, let me start like summarizing and making sure we kind of have a picture of what these results mean. So the first thing that I want us to point is to the fact that Uganda is a country where you have a right to work, you have a right to live wherever you want. You could migrate if you wanted, and we still see that household did not respond to the economic shock by doing that. People are also allowed to buy land, to own land, to rent land. We also didn't see an increase in farming intensity. And so this should suggest that just wanting or being incentivized to increase labor supply doesn't mean that you'll be able to work if labor markets are saturated, right? If the demand for labor doesn't increase, right? The fact that you're able to legally to own land and rent land doesn't mean that you can increase farming if access to arable land is tightly constrained by local leaders, by the host communities. And the fact that you're allowed to move legally out of the camp doesn't mean that you're going to do it, given the fact that migration is very risky, could be risky and quite costly. So the first big takeaway that we want you to come out of this, of our findings, is legal rights for refugees to work and move freely are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient when labor demand is weak, when land is scarce, and when liquidity is tight. So that's the first thing we wanted you to take from our finding. The second thing, it is striking that we see that results deteriorate along multiple dimensions, also for the group that retain the same level of support. So if we think about like the general equilibrium, the whole economy of the camp, we see that 8 cats for the majority, this 86% of the camps had the provisions being reduced by either 50% or even for the least vulnerable all the way to 0. When 8 cuts apply for so many people, it will reduce local demand, right? This can weaken labor markets, and this can weaken demand also for services and products. And so it means that opportunities for everyone goes down, right? And so even though prioritization is the targeting of the most needy can preserve the level of transfer, that doesn't mean that they can be able to withstand these kind of wide shocks. So the second takeaway from this study is that targeting can preserve the level of support for the most needy, but it can't protect the livelihoods when local refugee economies contract as a whole. Now, these findings have implications both for policy and maybe also for how we think about research. For policy, the key, I think one of the key implications is they're just hoping that people will respond to the reduction in aid by increasing the margins of employment or farming. Is just not realistic, right? Because land is not available, because migration is very costly, because labor markets are already extremely tight, right? There's already a lot of slack in the labor market. So the idea is what I think is important to take away from a policy perspective is that prioritization will have to be, or aid reductions will have to be accompanied by other ways of helping refugees to, for example, relocate to secondary city by maybe providing subsidies, or helping them move into the labor market by providing job placement and training. And the bottom line message is that we can't expect individual level adaptation to absorb such a large system-wide shock. From a policy perspective, from a research perspective, I think we identified a vicious cycle where the aid cuts reduce demand for labor. So people have less disposable income. And so there's less consumption of services. And so it's harder to adopt productive coping mechanisms. So you take more debt. And if you take more debt and you have, that means that you further will have less demand for labor. And so what we saw that not only refugees were subjected to the policy of did not respond by increasing the margins of productive strategies, we see that by year 2, things got worse to everyone, right? And we would have missed it if we would have just studied, say, a year after prioritization. So for us, this suggests that there could be this vicious cycle that things get worse as time continues. For us, this suggests that it's important not just to focus on short-term evaluations of prioritization, but look at longer-term outcomes because things are dynamic. They don't stay. They're not static. Okay. Let me kind of wrap up. There's a few limitations of the study. We study only those. The RD identifies only local effects around the cutoff. So we know what happens around the cutoff, but we don't know what happened to people really outside of the vulnerability score. So I think future work should definitely look at that. We also didn't report what happens to children and schooling and child labor and child marriage, and so these are things that we're going to be trying to address in future paper. So please stay tuned. And this is kind of my last slide. We collected data in 2023 and 2024. In 2025, after the termination of USAID, there was even a more dramatic shortfalls in the funds available to WFP and UNHCR. And in 2025, they reduced level of support to a really large number of refugees all the way to zero, right? And so we just received some funding to try to understand what are the implications of not just reducing to something like 30% of what happens when you get zero, right? And it's possible that moving from 60% to 30% is different from moving from 30% to 60%, so sorry, to zero. And so this is some of the things that we will be doing in the coming months. I'll just say that like Uganda is the best case scenario in the sense that like there's a right to work and right to move freely, and but these prioritization policies are happening also in countries like Kenya, where refugees don't have the right to do that, and so we also want to urge the research community to also look at what happens in some of these like other countries. We think that it's probably also not a positive story. So let me end here and take some of the questions. Thank you so much for your patience with me and for listening to this talk.
Audio on.
Should I stop sharing the screen?
No, yeah, you can, yes. So before I go to the 10 fascinating questions that came from the audience, which I'll review in a moment, just one small figure captured my attention, so I'll take precedence here. 92% of your household heads are female. Where are all these male Sudanese? Are they in Sudan with their camels and cattle, providing support that your measures don't precisely capture? But in any event, where are all the male heads of households?
Yeah, thanks for that. So one thing I didn't mention is that while we don't see that like aid reduction increased migration differentially to the two groups, we do see still an exit of not of the whole household en masse. So what we see is like there's very little migration of the whole household out of the camp, because in the camp you still have housing, you get access to services. Sometimes there's a small plot of land for subsistence, and there's still ratios, right? And so it's very common that the wife and the children will stay in the camp, and at least for a subset of the household, the male will be moving out to look for other opportunities. But what we've found was that almost all of those males that are missing, that are leaving, almost all are back to South Sudan, rather than move to like secondary cities in Uganda or to Kampala with a lot of job opportunities. And our sense is that these are moves to South Sudan to see whether it's possible maybe to go back, right? To see, can we get access back to our can we go? Is it safe enough to go back to our villages? Is it safe enough to go out to our businesses there? They seem to be more exploratory in nature rather than income generating. And the reason we're quite confident in that is because something like 29% of households report that at some point a household member, so it could have been that they left even before prioritization, a household member has left to South Sudan, but only 6% report receiving remittances, right? And so this suggests that it's not necessarily the case that they're moving to South Sudan because they believe that that's where there's like, a lot of income generating opportunities. This seems to be moves of kind of testing the water, whether it's safe to go back, arguably under duress.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that many years ago I visited a refugee camp in Somalia, Ethiopia border, and the women were all there, and the men were keeping their herds alive, and so from a family perspective, the value of their herds were part of their wealth. But with your point about
Yeah.
remittances, I guess you're showing that this is not happening in a way that's productive for the women household heads.
Uh, no, because they're not, at least from what they report, they're not showing back. I mean, I think it's possible that there's, cattle. I mean, cattle is very expensive. I mean, the population that we're dealing with, among those that report that they have some wage employment, I should have mentioned it during the talk. The mean is about of the wage is about $1 a day. Okay. And in a month, it's about like $22, $23 that they make a month from wage employment on average. These are not margins that you can use to invest in cattle, right? Like so. Uh, yeah. So my sense is yes, there are yes, older sons and husbands might be moving to try and to maybe places that have like opportunities, but as I said, mostly back to South Sudan, and not in a way that supports the family back in the settlements.
Thank you for that. Many of the questions were on heterogeneity. So Betty Keller says, does the study shed light? Here we go. This is sort of uh, um, study on who is more or less likely to adopt productive versus destructive coping strategy in the context of reduced aid. Any insights on how the choice of strategy may be impacted by factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, religiosity, kinship dynamics, language, level of education, duration of time spent in camps, country of origin, etc., etc. How much
Yeah.
heterogeneity analysis were you able to do on who is most productive and most failing in coping?
That's a great question. So short answer, we haven't done yet heterogeneous effect, so I don't have an answer to that question, but thanks for raising it. I will just say that like on some of the factors that you mentioned, we don't have much variation to begin with, right? So 99% of the households are from South Sudan. So there's no variation on country of origin. And 92% of the households heads are women. So there's not a lot of like gender dynamic that we can explore. Levels of education and literacy are very low across the board. I don't think we can explore much there, but I think it will be important from a policy perspective to try and understand what is the like characteristics of households that are more likely to engage in productive strategies, and what are the characteristics of households that are more likely to engage in what we refer to as destructive strategies. And I think I mean, it's on our list. We haven't got to that yet.
Ahmed Gulek asks, thank you for really interesting presentation, which is everybody was saying. I had a question about the baseline labor market conditions. Could you share a bit more about the employment and unemployment rates of both refugees and natives in the area prior to the intervention?
Yeah. So in this study, we collected data on refugees. My co-authors Yang and Shelby has a survey also of the local population that lives adjacent to the refugee settlement. So they can respond to that. If people should feel free to reach out to them on that. On the question on refugees, the level of employment around 40% of household heads report being employed or self-employed at baseline, and then it goes down to around 35% by. But I should say we don't have a pure baseline, right? The first time we collected data was a year after privatization. And so a year after, it's around 40%, 2 years after, it's around 35%. And as I said, in terms of like work, they report around working about 50 hours a month and earning about $1 a day on average. Of course, there's variation.
So Andrea Hrenko says between 2024 and 2025, outcomes worsen even for households that keep their pre-existing aid level. How should we interpret the local effects of the 50% ration cut against the backdrop? Is it best thought of as additional harm on top of a system-wide deterioration? Or do we see any evidence that the cuts themselves are part of what's doing the broader decline?
I think it's hard to separate. I mean, I think what was striking is that it is not the case that we're not seeing a change. So think about the first like few slides of like employment and migration and farming intensity, right? We're not seeing a difference between those that retain and those that those that had the aid cut by 50%, right? But that could be also in a world in which nothing like things stay the same for both groups, right? But that is not the case. We see that for both groups, there's real large declines in mental health, in physical health, in life satisfaction. We see an increase in crime and crime victimization. We see a big decline and then we see a decline for both groups in employment, especially in hours worked, and in hourly wage, right? And so for us, this suggests that the refugee settlement economy is suffering a shock in total, right? That it's not, you can't really, if 86% of the refugee population is getting significantly less, there's just less money around, right? Less money around. It means that I'm going to consume less services and I'll buy less products from my neighbors. And so they will have less money to buy from me. They will have less money to hire me. They will maybe pay me less if they do hire me, right? And so the key point is that you can keep the same level of support for the most vulnerable, but you can't protect them from the shock, right? Like so, because when the whole economy starts, the refugee settlement economy starts like tanking, everyone is affected. You cannot protect people just by leaving the same level of support because they're not immune from the fact that their neighbors will be buying less from them and paying them less for the employment. And so I think that's the main kind of, for us, the main message is that like one of the key messages is that you can engage in targeting of like the most vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily protect them when there's like a major shock. And relatedly, that we can't expect kind of individual level adaptation, right? It's not that, in the face of these system-wide changes, we can't expect the refugee to respond by saying, okay, I'm going to increase my labor supply. I'm gonna try to work more hours. I'm going to try to when they are subjected to a major retrenchment of the entire refugee camp economy. So we can't expect people to respond individually, and we can't expect that targeting of the most vulnerable will protect those that are deemed most vulnerable.
So Stefan He asks, after saying, thanks for an excellent presentation, how honest were the mid-2022 census survey answers regarding vulnerability? Did the respondents have some sense that the vulnerability answers would have an impact on their future targeting and distributions?
Thanks for that question. So to the best of our understanding, and this comes from many conversations that we had with UNHCR and WFP, which again, I want to extend gratitude to all the support that they provided us in this study. When the census took place in mid-2020, sorry, 2022, refugee households were not aware that prioritization is on the horizon. It was not discussed in the media. It was not discussed in the camps. From their perspective, there was just a census. There was a survey. And they asked questions for every household in 1 million households in Uganda. Now, how truthful the responses are, it's hard to know, right? Like, I think one from our perspective, the fact that we're seeing that there's no difference between households on either side of the cutoff suggests that people were not really manipulating their answers, right? It's not the case that somehow in a systematic way we see that people that are deemed most vulnerable are somehow very, kind of systematically. I mean, we are really comparing people at the 10 percentile, 11, 12, 13 percentile to 14, 15, 16 percentile. So if you take all households, the 1 million households in refugee households in Uganda, and you put them from 0 to 100 and percentiles on kind of like vulnerability, we're comparing the 11, 12, 13, 14 to 15, 16, 17. We're not seeing kind of like differences on each side of the cutoff, suggesting that that people were not necessarily gaming the system, but it's also the case that like people found it quite arbitrary. And when we asked refugees themselves about what they thought about the policy, so most they say it's a bad policy, and many of them say it's unfair, and many say that they don't understand why they're here, not there, because it seems quite arbitrary that their neighbor that they feel like is as equally poor as them, suddenly they retain level of support, and for them it was cut by half. So all of these kind of seem to suggest that there wasn't gaming, but like I don't want to rule that completely because it is possible that like there was maybe I should say most of the questions that we used into the vulnerability score are also factual, right? Like they are like, is there somebody with like chronic illness in the household? Is it like single house? Is there like a number of kids under a certain age? So some of these ones are also hard to manipulate.
So I didn't quite summarize Ahmed Gulek's question. He wanted to know if you compared the refugee population, unemployment, and coping strategies with local natives. Maybe there was a general decline in the region rather than one that was affected by the strategy of or the effects on the refugees.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I mean, the findings that we have in the beginning, where we compare like the two groups, that's where the RDD kicks in. That we have like really nice identification. I should just mention that the findings that we have between round 1 and round 2 are not well identified, right? That these are just trends that could be also related to like how the economy is doing, and not just the refugee population. And I think the the suggestion that implied from the question to compare to how locals were doing during the same period as a benchmark to whether this is a contraction of the entire economy or something that is more unique to the refugee economy, I think is a great piece of advice and is something that we will do in the next iteration of the paper.
So time is up. Thank you so much, Guy, for this fascinating presentation. And thank you to the audience for all your great questions, only some of which I could summarize. And I have to close now, but I'm already looking forward to the next seminar, March 12th, with Vasiliki Fuka making the presentation. Guy, thanks again.
Thank
and
you
be
so
well.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye.